What is going on, guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another video on the PS4. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the cbomb issue and seeing how much of a problem this issue is for a jailbroken PS4. How big of an issue is it? How fixable is it on a jailbroken PS4? That is what we're going to be checking out here in this video. So if you're not familiar with the cbomb issue, the CMOS battery clock death issue. So the issue basically is that you have a CMOS battery in your PS4 and it keeps the clock ticking, the internal system clock, the kernel clock ticking, even when power is cut from the console. That way, if you don't have your PS4 plugged in to the power for a long period of time, and then you go and plug it back in again and fire it up, it should still be on the correct date and time, which can be further synchronized via the internet. Now, the problem with this is that when your CMOS battery dies, which generally CMOS batteries tend to last about 10 to 15 years, from my experience anyway. So when a CMOS battery dies, it will reset the clock. And normally this is fairly straightforward to fix. You just have to swap the CMOS battery with a new one. So open up the system, take the old battery out, put the new one in, and then you should be good to go. The problem is it needs to be resynchronized with Sony's servers. And in the future, when Sony drops support for their live services for the PS4, then what's going to end up happening potentially, unless they fix this in a firmware update, is that you're not going to be able to resynchronize the clock. And the problem with that is that when the clock is not synchronized via the internet, you will end up not being able to run any of your games. So there's an error that pops up which is related to the trophies. So any game that has trophies are not going to work because the trophies use the internal clock for the timestamp for when you unlocked the trophy. And the issue with that obviously is that they want to keep that as accurate as possible. So if your kernel clock gets reset, then the trophies cannot get an accurate timestamp, and therefore it basically just stops the whole game from launching when you have a game that has trophies installed, which are most games. So even games on a disc or games you downloaded from the store, none of your games will run. So this is obviously kind of blown up over the past few weeks since this has been discovered. And there's been loads of, media attention over this. Lots of large YouTube commentary channels covering this. Lots of media outlets covering this issue. So what I'm interested in is how easy is it to fix this on a jailbroken PS4? Is it fixable? And, how big of a deal is this if your PS4 is jailbroken? Can you still run your games? So in order to test this, I'm testing this on a 6.72 jailbroken PS4. So what I did to test this, first of all, is I went ahead and cached the exploit in the browser so I can load the jailbreak offline. And then I went ahead and disconnected the console from the internet, took it apart, opened it all up to get to the CMOS battery, removed the CMOS battery while also breaking one of the clips in the process, because, as you do. So I basically just took the CMOS battery out and put it back in just to simulate replacing a dead battery with a new one. So I rebooted the console and went to check the clock, and as you can see through the date and time settings, it reset the clock back to 1970. So obviously you can set the clock manually. You can go to a manual clock setup and set the clock to the correct date and time, but that doesn't actually change the internal kernel clock. That just is like its own separate clock. So the internal clock will still be reset back to 1970s. So I tried to run my copy of Black Ops 3, a disc game, and as you can see, when I run the game, it kind of starts to load the game and then it immediately kicks me out. It even signs me out of my profile and it gives me this error, this CE error. So it will not let me run any of my games. So obviously the first thing that I tried to do was try and load a fake package game. So a fake package game is a kind of decrypted game that you can run on a jailbroken PS4 without the original license file. So I tried to run that by using, Mira and the homebrew enabler payload, and unfortunately it has the same exact issue. So you try and run the game and it just kicks you out as soon as it starts loading with that same error message. So in terms of actual fixes for this, there's a kind of temporary fix that works right now. And then there's another permanent fix that's still a work in progress. So in terms of a temporary fix, what you can do is you can use the gold hen payload. So the gold hen payload actually has something built in to allow the games to run. It has some kind of bypass to fix this issue. So any fake package game, any decrypted game that you run by using the gold hen payload will allow you to run the game without any issues. As far as I can tell, it seems to run absolutely fine. Now, older versions of the homebrew enabler payload do not work. Initially, I thought they would because they have an option to enable debug trophies, which I thought might fix the issue, but that's not the case. It's only gold hen right now. That's the only payload that seems to implement this fix to allow the games to run. But again, I say that that's a temporary fix because that will only work on fake package games, decrypted games. You still won't be able to run any of your retail games, any of your game discs, even when you're running the gold hen payload. If you try and run the game like a retail copy, like a disc game, with the gold hen payload running, it will actually just crash the console, which is kind of strange, but that's what's happening at the moment. So in terms of a permanent fix, there was a payload back in the day called React PS Plus. Back in 2018, when the 5.05 exploit came out, you had React PS Plus. And what React PS Plus does is it changes the kernel clock to 2013. And the reason that this payload existed, it was a way of reactivating PS Plus games that had expired. So if you rented games from the store and you still had them on the PS4, but your time had expired, you could reset the kernel clock back to 2013, which would reactivate all of those games that had expired and allow you to run them again. Because again, their expiry date and time was based on the kernel clock. So there was this payload, React PS Plus, to reset back to 2013, and a undo payload, which would put it back to 2018. But unfortunately, this payload has kind of gone unused for a long time. It has been updated to support 7.55, and it's been renamed to kernel clock. So the payload is now just called the kernel clock payload. But unfortunately, after update 5.07, Sony changed the function that actually changes the kernel clock. They've kind of redone the way that it works. So unfortunately, this payload will only work up to 5.07 firmware. Any firmwares higher than 5.07, the kernel clock payload will not currently work. So that's why I say it's kind of a work in progress, because now that this CMOS issue has kind of, blown up all over the place, I'm sure that this payload will be updated soon. Some developer will come along and implement a working version for the higher firmwares, and then that will be the way to fix this issue. All you'll have to do then, once that payload is fixed, is inject that payload, and it will change the kernel clock or reset the kernel clock to allow the games to run. So that is essentially the way to do it. So I'll just show you how that works right now, even though this version of the payload doesn't work because it's not been updated yet. And once this kernel clock payload gets updated to support the higher firmwares, I'll put a pinned comment in the comments section to say that the payload has been updated. And I'll link, obviously, the download link to the kernel clock payload in the description. But basically, all you need to do is, inject the payload using Netcat GUI or some other payload injector, and it will go ahead and reset the kernel clock and fix the issue. But obviously, we'll have to wait for that payload to be updated before that fix can be implemented. So generally, right now, the only fix from when I'm recording this video is to use the gold hen payload to run fake package versions of your games, because that will run just fine. However, if you're wanting a permanent fix, you'll have to wait for the kernel clock payload to be updated to support the higher firmwares. And then once that's done, you'll be able to just inject this kernel clock payload, which will reset the kernel clock and allow your games to run, fixing the issue without having to sync up to Sony's servers. So yeah, again, this issue isn't really a big deal right now because obviously Sony's servers are still active for the PS4 and they probably will be for quite a few years yet. However, this potentially could happen in the future where Sony's servers go down and there's no way to resynchronize the clock. A lot of people's CMOS batteries will be dying around about then, and you'll be stuck with a paperweight console that can't run any games unless you have your PS4 jailbroken, where you can run a kernel clock payload to reset the clock and get your games running again. So yeah, anyway, I thought that was interesting. I had quite a few people requesting I make a video about this whole battery clock death, the cbomb issue. So yeah, now you guys know it's definitely fixable on a jailbroken PS4. You have the temporary fix of gold hen, and you'll have a permanent fix at some point soon in the future once the kernel clock payload gets updated, and you'll be able to run all of your games again. So yeah, it's definitely fixable on a jailbroken PS4. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.